responses. And just as part of the invitation, Ryan and I offered themes of embeddedness and belovedness and trying things on and saying yes to the Spirit, coming to moments of transition, getting clear about our expectations, returning to our earliest longings. So we've covered a wide area, and we're wondering what question is on your heart. We don't have to answer all the questions, right? But what question is really close to your heart that you'd like to speak out loud, maybe even as an invitation for your ongoing inquiry that we can't even address today. Is that all right? What would you add to that, Ryan?
No, I mean, the language we use at Beloved, usually after proclamations is, what have you heard yourself asking or saying as you've been listening?
Yeah, that's great.
A couple people asked me how the Doctor Who conversation went, and it was just two of us. It was one of those interesting things that, sort of like Bible study in the Episcopal Church. Everybody wants to do it, but nobody comes. So, but it was interesting because Katrina and I had this great conversation, but it wasn't like, ooh, like lots of excitement. And what I realized, it came from the thing about this talk about images, was that what I really want to communicate to my students that I get from Doctor Who is the look on particularly David Tennant's face when he is delighted with the humans, that look of delight. And so the question that comes to my mind is that I think, to start asking my students is, what does God look like when God is delighted with you?
Yeah. Oh, great. Mm-hmm. Yeah. We started to talk about that in our Episcopal Bible study. In the language of good, and
does God like you? Has become my question.
Yeah. God has to love us. Does God like us?
Amity?
The question that's bubbling up for me is recognizing the challenge of, for me, to tell my story and to be inspired, particularly by you, Tom, of being a beautiful storyteller. And that at 39, that's a challenge for me. I've had some time to get to know my own story. And what are some tools to coach, mentor, guide young adults, particularly college age or just after college, to help them understand and tell their story? And it seems to me that that's just core of the faith journey. And I'm not necessarily looking for a particular curriculum, but just recognizing that me in middle age, that's hard to do, and how much more challenging it must be for younger people, and to have the courage to share that with others.
Thank you.
We, as a community, we've worked through a book by Dan Allender called To Be Told, and he just moves through kind of 4 stages of any good story, right? That it always starts out with shalom. There's an equilibrium, and then that's shattered, right? And then there's kind of the protagonist's attempt to regain that shalom and striving after that. And then there's something of the surprise of grace, where something that we could not manufacture on our own happens for us. And that's the denouement, right? The unloosening of that, even if it's just for a moment, even if it's just a rest from that, but there's always reunion, and there's always usually feasting of some kind too in there. And I think that we can kind of look back over our own stories and start, like, just with those kind of simple categories, start to think about different chapters in our lives and different shaloms we've experienced. What are the smells of it? What's the setting of it? Who are the characters of it? That's been really helpful to our community as we try to tell and understand, figure out our stories, and rewrite our own stories even. Yeah.
Could you name the book and author?
Yeah, it's Dan Allender. To Be Told is the book.
I thought you said Ted Hagler, and I thought,
I'm learning, you reminded me, note to self from Amity is cherish good stories and spend time cherishing them, relishing a good story. And at the end of some of our Art of Hosting trainings, at the end of all of them now, we do Friday afternoon through Saturday noon creation of video clips around learnings from new ministries. And the whole thing is inviting teams of people to co-edit a story that we start out with and get it ready for a 3-minute video clip. And so part of it is we teach people to notice the high point of the story, where their heart most connected with the energy of the story, and then shuffle the start and finish of that 3-minute video clip around that. And then we create the first 10 words, the last 10 words, the first 30 seconds, last 30 seconds, to showcase the 2-minute clip in the center of it. Now, all of that is quite mechanical. But what I've realized from watching people doing this, Amity, is what I want more in my life is I want to be a better story listener, a story drawer, outer. And I'd like to be more intentional about negotiating co-editing space with people around their usual story, which tends to be pretty thin. We say it's a thin story. How do we thicken the story together? How do we move toward the preferred story, like Jesus does in Luke 4? This is God's dream for all of creation, and he speaks of it as though it were already true. I think we can do that in everyday life. And it doesn't need to be an interview back and forth or a scripting. For me, it's how do I keep my childlike curiosity alive? My great goal is to be 90 and more curious than I am now.
Right now you have a little question mark over your head.
I do. Just hovering. Is it? Thank you. Wow. Thank you for noticing. Oh, you mean it's on the screen? Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Good.
Will you let me know when it's not there anymore? Years to come.
Ira Glass does some fun things too.
Oh.
He has some like YouTube videos that are really fun. It's more mechanical, but you know.
So the question that I often have, I feel like it kind of fits in, but at the same time, it's like a very basic yet very complicated question. Because what I always wonder is, how do I meet the needs of the deep needs of the world without getting swallowed up by them?
What a great group to ask that question in. What a great group in which to ask that question. We could just stop right here and turn to each other and say, how are you all doing that? Tom, right? Yeah. Thank you for... How are we doing with that? We have a little cross talk here, yes.
It is, after all, your deep joy that's meeting the deep needs of the world. It's your deep joy that is meeting the deep needs of the world. If you're meeting the deep needs of the world just because the needs of the world are deep, you will indeed drown, right? But the response comes from the joy. One of my favorite theologians is Elvis, who says, if this can't be fun, we're not going to do it anymore.
Reed, what are the practices of nurturing the deep joy that I see in you? How do you do that?
I sing.
You sing.
Yeah. And make music. So in my ministry, Canterbury House is all about music all the time.
Mm-hmm. So for you personally, when you're tempted to work really hard and you make the choice to stay closer to joy than productivity, How do you manage the expectations around you that really want you to look busy and work hard?
Oh, well, I don't always succeed at that.
Yeah.
Sometimes I succumb to it.
Yeah.
But if I'm successful in resisting it, it's because, I got up and went out on the porch and smoked my pipe and listened to some music, or, picked up my mandolin and sang something, or
Wow.
yeah.
I think it's our big idolatry. I mean, I think it just exposes, like, we don't have a God. We don't believe we have a God.
We don't practice Sabbath.
Yeah, because we got to get shit done, because no one else will. We don't do this. You know what I mean?
Yes.
Yeah.
Amen is right.
Yeah.
Yes. Can we get a witness on that one? Yeah.
Getting my steps in.
You are. Fitbit, here we come.
One of the directions I wasn't expecting the conference to go was what we were touching on earlier with saying yes and sometimes hearing no. What the time I've said yes, it took some convincing. There's something that's been placed in front of me. My immediate reaction was no. And then over time, I've come to say yes. So I said yes, and then I went on this journey, and then the answer was no. And there was one of the small groups earlier was about, I want to hear your story about saying yes, but I would like to hear some stories about what people have done with that. And I'm sure maybe I'm the only one that heard a no and had a door closed. But what did I do with the no? How did we learn? It took me a decade, but how did I learn to give thanks for the no that I couldn't understand at the time, but now is very apparent, why that happened. So, what are people's stories of hearing no, and what do they now understand about that no? So I just wanted to throw that out there.
You're calling an open space session right there, really. That would be a great convening.
So maybe for tomorrow.
Yeah. I know a couple of things about what you're describing. And one of those is, if I flip out of my disappointment too quickly, I tend to be a fatalist in future opportunities. Like, whatever happens, happens. I don't believe Jesus was Buddhist. I think Jesus really was wrapped up in some outcomes and pretty committed and attached and got dragged around by the outcomes. Like the choice to show love over power, to live into that in a very practical, lived-in experience, for me, is a powerful commitment to a certain way of being present in the world that leaves room for disappointment and grief and sorrow and suffering. Yes, when the yo I was expecting turns into a no. The yes doesn't show up. Because I thought I was hearing from God. I thought I was clear in the presence of many witnesses. And I have a sense that we misunderstand the basic teachings of Buddhism around there. We've actually made it a very convenient ally for Christianity that calls us to struggle. And sometimes the struggle is just what you've named. What do I do with this no that is lodged in my soul that makes it hard for me to say yes to God in the future? And I think that's part of where the lament and travail and pain of being a midwife to the Spirit comes alongside being a warrior as well. It is both and. And sometimes we grieve with a God who wanted a yes and got a no also. I hope you will convene that conversation.
So what are the practices of permission giving that we use to help folks engage more deeply with their stories and share those stories with others? Not that it needs to depend on, someone to say, I hereby permission you to share, but I know in my life and I've seen that Sometimes there's cues or stories shared or things that help people loosen to more deeply engage with themselves and others.
Well, I mean, just self-truth telling, and being really particular about your story, not living in the generalities, right? Because for some reason we just identify with the particular, even if they're not our particulars. And that frees people up immensely, right? So if we tell the truth about ourselves, that we know about ourselves. Yeah. Maybe Michael, you got something you want to say about that?
I'm playing this out in my head at a fellowship on Tuesday night where I have a student sitting around and I'm really wanting them to engage in this storytelling. But I have a group of students that aren't really seniors. They're mostly freshmen, and I'm sure they're afraid that people are going to find out who they are. And it's like now they know kind of a thing. And there's not a whole lot of trust, and this is a trust-building thing. So my question is, do you know of any particular, say, tools or exercises or sort of group things that I could use or do that would enable them to loosen up and to share with each other in a more, say, helpful and caring way rather than a funny ha-ha way. Right. That where they'll take this seriously and respect another's privacy.
And alcohol's not an option, right? Okay, just making sure. I don't know. Do you want ideas?
For me, it starts with making a shift. And so I keep asking the question, what does it take for us to shift from storytelling to story listening? Story listening as spiritual practice. And I'm the latter, the story listening, community of story listeners is passionate about offering safe space to be risky. And for me, the foundation is to start with love. So you got to have 2 or 3 people who really love each other, who start to model this behavior of providing safe space to be risky. And I say it that way because when I say safe space, people will say, no, there's nothing safe about it. It's risky business. And then when I say it's risky space, well, aren't you trying to create safety? So now I say both together. Trying to create the safe space for us to be risky. And despite all the training we've received so far, offer your own best example of what that looks like. So begin by sharing your own, as Ryan just said, your own vulnerability. And even if you have to teach people how to do it, teach them how to cherish this vulnerability and this story, this piece of the story that you've just shared. The people who've probably done the best work around this are Australian and New Zealand practitioners of narrative therapy who've had to intentionally engage multi-ethnic communities where they've focused on what it's like to sustain hope when you're not the dominant culture and you're still being colonialized by the dominant culture. How did you stay in touch with your spirit? How did you stay in touch with your faith and your hopefulness? And the narrative practices that grew out of that are huge learnings for the rest of us. And narrative practice and archaeology of hope is the primary text for all of that work. It's very accessible to leaders in faith communities. It's written by Gerald Monk and David Epstein. It's called Narrative Practice, and Archaeology of Hope. And I read it about once a year for its depth. And they really spend a lot of time talking about how you set it up, how you set a small community up to cherish the narratives that eventually make us who we are. Because behind our identity is always story. It's always, we construct our meaning with stories. We construct our identity with stories. And if we don't do it, somebody else will do it for us. It's one of their... And so they're just very thoughtful about how we engage people who are not used to being listened to, who have lost their voice and yet have the greatest gifts to share with us, how to be how to be bold and assertive in our practices and yet nimble and humble in the way we respond to the shifting story that we encounter, usually by surprise. So that's the primary text. A guy who's written about it inside faith communities, usually in redeveloping communities, is Mark Lau Branson, who writes about his experience in a Presbyterian Japanese American church not far from you, I think, in the Pacific Northwest. And it's called Memories, Hopes, and Conversations, or Memories, Hopes, and Conversations Redevelopment. If you just look up Mark Lau Branson, he's an adjunct faculty at Fuller Seminary. But at the core, it's modeling reverence for stories that are outside the norm, stories that surprise us, stories that wake us up, and modeling how we cherish those even in unexpected moments of grace.
I love that so much of our New Testament existed in this oral form for generations prior to being written down, and that it existed in community that way, right? And so we try to practice that in our community. We try to practice an oral tradition, and so we'll say something like, hey, who remembers a story about when Jesus went to dinner, or something like that? And people will kind of add to it, and then we'll take that story and we'll say, okay, does this make you think of any stories from your life? And then that'll just kind of be like a way to enter the story. The other thing it makes me think of is I was a part of a small group for many years, and we practiced storytelling in the small group. And we called it work, though, usually, And the thing that made it the safest was we said, there's no advice giving here.
Nice.
That just kills vulnerability is advice giving, typically, right? Unless, because it infantizes. But unless there's something that's asked for. So the person who's doing work always has to ask for what they want in the group. I want you simply to be a witness to my story. I want you to, identify with me in some way. I want you to, and they're in control of it, right? So that, I think, that felt like the most empowering thing for that group.
I've got a question about the Church of the Beloved and its formation. And I was in the conversation earlier today about loyal dissent and rule breaking in worship and breaking rules for the sake of worship that remains alive. And I'm just wondering what some of the practicalities were around creating the community and getting permissions for the community to come into being. It may be as simple as you've got a really cool bishop, but I didn't see everyone with, the Lutheran Book of Worship in their hands. So did the community form and then become recognized as the LCA? Was there permission from the get-go? And what's that been like?
We call ourselves creatively Lutheran. So, I think because we're a confessing church, that there's a lot more freedom in that regard. And we played with this a lot when we were at... Yeah. Oh, okay. So, you pray your who you are, your identity, right? You pray your identity. And Lutherans confess their identity, so we kind of we theologize our identity, in a way, right? That's probably not the best way to say it, but so for Church of the Beloved, we have kind of talk about it as a living Lutheranism, but there's probably 2 people in our community who grew up Lutheran, so this is kind of an adopted thing for many of us, and so we don't even talk about being Lutheran that frequently, but but I'm excited about Lutheran theology, and so it kind of just seeps in. The theology of the cross just seeps into what we're doing, The use of technology like the pipe organ or like the printing press, that's just kind of part of our heritage, So we kind of see a lot of freedom in that, and we haven't had our wrists slapped ever. So we just go for it, and it's not helpful to you, but sorry. We follow, we do follow some things, right? We want to color in within certain lines, because when you just have an empty canvas for liturgy, you're just like, I don't know, right? But, We say, look, a fourfold pattern of worship, that's just natural to human experience. When I come over to dinner at your place, you welcome me in, right? We have an invocation of sorts. We have a gathering right together, you know? And then then we sit down and you say, well, tell me about your week. What's been going on? We do this with our liturgy of the word. We say, God, what have you been up to in the world? Both in the past and now, let's reflect upon that, right? And then you invite me to your dinner table, and we share the intimacy of a meal together. You share presence with one another, right? You do this at the table, And then you send me on my way and you say, oh, well, here's your jacket. It's been so, bless you, you bless me. And there it is. There's our liturgy together. Liturgy is all around you, right? So have fun with it.
So I think we're going to work on wrapping up our time. I feel like old school Phil Donahue or Oprah or something.